Women are historically and commonly discouraged from being experts on their own bodies, okay? And so what we tend to find is that religion, a male partner or husband, culture, a medical system, an ideology will assert and enforce its own beliefs around women, their bodies, and women's sexuality and women's right even to sexual pleasure. And so what we're really dealing with here is this authority contract. The fact of the matter is systems of power do not want women to hold rightful authority over their own bodies and specifically their own sexual pleasure. And the reason why this comes up so often is because, of course, we live in a world that is constantly talking about whether or not women should have, okay, the sexual freedoms that they have now. And what I have observed is, especially when you have feminists talking about hookup culture, casual sex culture, etc., and then when you have maybe conservative religious commentators, the part where they start to converge at times, and I'm not talking about all feminists, I'm talking about a certain type of feminists, the part where they start to converge and agree is that ultimately women should be reserving sex for within marriage with men. And what I will say before we explore this in this particular video is that this conversation isn't about whether it's right or wrong for women to have sex with whomever they want to have sex with, and whether it's right or wrong for women to have sex outside of marriage, because the entire point of this is about authority and the fact that adult women should have the rightful authority to decide what they do with their bodies. And we live in a world that is always trying to strip women of their authority when it comes to their bodies and when it comes to sexuality and pleasure more generally. Okay, because depending upon your culture, your religion or religious background, etc., a lot of the times women are told not to explore themselves, not to touch themselves, not to become too focused on pleasure. I remember when I was growing up in my former religion, one of the wives said to me that her husband likens sex to salt that you put on chips or when you're seasoning meat. Okay, it's sparing, it's extra. Okay, and so women in general, okay, because we are discouraged from being selfish, i.e. thinking of oneself, putting yourself first, this moves through into sexuality and your experience of pleasure as a woman. The other kind of phenomenons that I want us to touch upon today in this video is that nowadays there is a discouragement from various quarters of women using sexual technology, right? I've always been fascinated by the femtech and sex tech space that are making massive advancements when it comes to women's health, women's reproductive reproduction, but yes, in the area of sexuality and pleasure. And it's very interesting to me. There are whole kind of conversations that happen in certain religious environments about whether or not it is right for women and or married couples, usually even in the marriage, to be using certain sex toys. And also more recently, I've seen a lot of conversation which is saying actually sex toys are desensitizing women and therefore contributing to greater dissatisfaction when they are engaging with sex with men, whether that's in or outside of marriage. And what I find is the golden thread throughout all of these conversations is two things. One, that women should not have authority over what they choose to do with their own body, but two, that women's pleasure is deprioritized. It is never the priority or the focus. Because isn't it funny that when you look at any kind of credible research out there, in addition to anecdotal qualitative data where women share their experiences, penetration is not a reliable guarantee for experiencing an orgasm. And yet we now have technology that has been developed which focuses on female pleasure and the female orgasm, and suddenly now certain systems of power and ideologies are saying actually no, you can't use that, when in actual fact before this technology was as accessible, what was happening? Were women experiencing consistent every time orgasms? No, not even inside a marriage that has been sanctioned by religion to be the only container within which a woman can have sex with God's approval and with social approval. Okay. And this is the thing. This is why this comes up so much in the training programs that I run, private ones, of course, with women around sex and the invisible contracts around sex, because it seems like actually it doesn't matter what ideology you're coming from, a school of thought you're coming from, a woman's pleasure and her right to that pleasure and her right to choose that pleasure is always being questioned along the way. In fact, I mean, look at this. Again, it's so funny to me when I see a lot of conversation happening about romance novels. It's really interesting to me because, obviously romance novels have recently really soared in popularity in the mainstream, right? I think that women were always reading this kind of literature, but I think it's really soared. And I think when younger generations openly talk about, the fact that they're reading this kind of literature and they're supporting the authors in this genre, obviously it brings it more into the mainstream. Absolutely. Because I remember when I was a young girl, a lot of the older women were reading Mills and Boots, for example. Now, in my former religion, they would talk about these romance novels and women would be discouraged from reading them. And they would literally say, because it creates unrealistic expectations. And I saw a really popular author, I think her name is Kennedy. It's either her first name or her surname. And she was interviewed recently. And she's a popular author in this genre. And one of the things she was saying is that she is writing the male character that women deserve, not the male character that can be reflected out in the world now. And I thought that was very interesting because when you actually even look at some of this literature, some of it is bare minimum behavior, to be honest, that the male character in the novel is demonstrating. And then the rest of it is intentional, is focused on female enjoyment and pleasure. So I find it very interesting when systems of power like religion, okay, and also, and it's so funny because there's a lady on TikTok, her video went viral. She was talking about the fact that she doesn't allow her children to read this kind of literature, and she is religious. Now, notwithstanding the fact that parents have a right and a responsibility to protect children and decide what their children are exposed to. But again, a lot of the comments underneath that video were interesting because she said it creates unrealistic expectations. And again, when you read some of this literature, even when you read the literature, you're talking about vampires and all sorts, okay? So it's not even like real human beings, some of it, but actually what women are responding to and resonating with is what they truly desire to experience when it comes to sex, when it comes to intimacy, when it comes to pleasure. And I find it ironic, let's just put it that way, that systems of power like religion, which need women to desire and get married, because as they say, strong families make strong congregations. You want women to desire and to get married. And yet you are not equipping, educating the women or the men in how to ensure that the sexual experience is pleasurable for her too. Because would that not mean that she would desire sex more often and enjoy it? But it seems to me, of course, that systems of power and then misogynistic men in particular, notice I said misogynistic men. I shouldn't always have to put an asterisk on that. I said misogynistic men. I did not say all men. But it seems to me that they're not invested in a woman's pleasure and her actual experience of the sex itself. They're just invested in her entering into marriage, following the status quo. And then afterwards, they criticize her, okay, for not being ever sexually available. Well, why would you want something you're not truly, deeply enjoying? Why would you want something that is not a mutual reciprocal in terms of pleasure experience for you? Okay. And the thing is that, look, a lot of religions as well, when they talk about whether or not it is right to masturbate or not, and look, you can come up with all the scriptures and whatever that indicate that masturbation is wrong or sinful or unclean. It's a spectrum depending upon the religion. But one of the arguments that is used very often is that masturbation makes you selfish. Okay, the idea is that sexual attention should be directed toward a future spouse rather than towards oneself. Okay, but what I find very interesting is that, again, if you listen to a lot of women, and this is millions of women, some of the videos I've done on the invisible contract of sex, you're talking thousands of comments plus the emails and the DMs. I see other women hosting and facilitating these conversations online and offline. A common theme is often that they have experienced male partners, including their husbands. And the reason why I always come back to that is because what we find is quite often women are told the reason why you're having these experiences is because you're having casual sex, because you are engaging with hookup culture. If only you would only have sex with one man, i.e. your husband, the experience, it would be a beautiful gift. Well, let's go and survey the married women, the women who did the things that the systems of power say you must do. And let's ask them what the sexual experience is actually like for them. Now, one of the common, it might be in the top one or two, is that their male partner, okay, was selfish. So I find this very interesting because, you know, really and truly, religion teaches people that masturbation is what makes you selfish. And yet what we find has been culturally the status quo within for sex between men and women and in marriage is that actually the male pleasure, which is often centered around penetration, is the priority. Because women are conditioned and programmed when it comes to sex into being accommodating, giving, serving, and available. That's how women are conditioned when it comes to sex, right? And the thing is that if you as a woman have been conditioned into being accommodating and attentive and focused on his pleasure, then are you going to have the language, the courage, the confidence, the authority that has been stripped away from you in terms of how and when and if you experience pleasure in your own body to say, actually, this is what I want, this is what I don't want, I like this, I don't like that, right? And the thing is as well, on top of all of this, is that in one of the comments under the video recently that I did on penetration, there was a man who, he said he was a cis het male and he regarded himself as a feminist. But one of the things he said in a very detailed response is that women should get on top more often and that way they can control the experience. And I think that's also interesting because so many women, I mean, if you're a young woman, if it's your new experience for you, you may not necessarily do that. And actually the way human beings generally speaking are conditioned around sex is that actually that isn't what women are doing very often. Now, there are some kind of colloquial, kind of social jokes that go around about women not getting on top, and that women don't have, you know, the interest or the stamina to do so. But actually, a lot of this sits at the feet of women in terms of your authority is stripped away from you in terms of what you can and can't do with your body. And then suddenly you're expected, okay, to speak up, to lead yourself to an orgasm. It doesn't make much sense when you think about the way women are generally conditioned around sex. And the thing is, if you're not allowed to explore your own body, okay, on your own terms, then you become dependent in the context of a marriage or relationship on the curiosity of the other person, the knowledge of the other person, whether that's knowledge they had at the beginning or knowledge that they've gone on to, gather in the process. You are dependent upon them being invested in your own pleasure. There's a dependency there, right? Because it's been built into the structure itself. And this is why, this is why it's so important actually for women, regardless of whether you have sex in marriage or outside marriage, to reclaim your authority over your own body and your right to pleasure. Because if you are literally just following what systems of power are teaching, pleasure is always somewhere else. It's always somewhere else, actually, because it's nobody else's priority. It has to be your priority. And I always say it's like hospitality. You know what I mean? Like when you invite somebody to your home for a meal or for socialization, generally speaking, a guest who turns up, okay, should bring some kind of offering or gift. Yeah, don't just turn up with your long hands. Don't just turn up with your long hands, empty hands. No, 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 no. Right? Generally speaking, especially in a lot of cultures, you turn up with an offering or gift. And so as a woman, when you are choosing to share your body with whoever it is, but actually, especially your husband, this is meant to be a sanctified, sacred marriage bed. And the person's not turning up with a gift for you. Withdraw the hospitality. Right? Withdraw the hospitality here. Because actually you prepared yourself and your body and the guest, because that's what they are, a guest. Whenever you're sharing your body, the other person is a guest and invitations can be revoked. Right? It's so important. You know, and I was watching a Nigerian podcast and the host, they were talking about this very issue around women and sex, specifically in their culture, of course. And he kept saying, well, this is a cultural issue and it will require patience. So hold on a minute. How long is it going to take to change? He was like, it's going to take years to change. So in the meantime, women should be what? Allowing their bodies to be used like ping pong machines until the cultural narrative changes? No. This is why it's so important on an individual level as a woman to reclaim authority over your own body and your own pleasure. Especially if you're playing by the so-called rules that systems of power, set out for us as women. Why are you in a marriage where you're not having any orgasms at all? You're not experiencing pleasure. It's mostly pressure. And then suddenly it's meant to be a collaborative teamwork endeavor. Now, use your critical thinking, because one thing I'm not saying, of course, is that that there isn't any level of communication and collaboration required. Of course not. What I'm saying is we live in a world where female pleasure is deprioritized and irrelevant, and containing and controlling female sexuality and availability and utility is always number one on the list. So as a woman, you have to be always sexually available for your husband. You have to be sexually useful to a man. Okay, within the sanctions that are allowed. So there's always a push to control and contain women sexually, and there'll be all sorts of reasons given. Your safety, biology, all of this nonsense. But ultimately it's about control and containment and stripping you of your authority to decide for yourself and your own body. That is why it is revolutionary. When women decide, actually, my pleasure is a priority, like I say, in whatever context or format. In whatever context or format, your pleasure can be your priority. It should be and can be your priority. So I just thought I would cover that. It's a question that comes up a lot. But ultimately, when it comes to this area of life for women, regardless of who you are, what your sexuality is, whether you're celibate, abstinent, because that's the other thing. A lot of the time, millions of women who are celibate, millions of women who are abstinent fall through the cracks on these conversations entirely, because women are presented either as, abstaining completely and being pure, or engaging in hookup, casual sex culture, or sex work, right? It's like the world can't fathom that there are women who are also exercising their authority, because if you choose to be celibate and or abstinent, that is your choice. And it is an active sexuality choice, right? Within that. And so your pleasure does not have to be dependent upon somebody else giving you the green light to say you deserve that pleasure now. It's not selfish at all. And actually, if more women said, you know what, I require as many orgasms as you're having when they interacted with male partners, I think that would change things greatly. Right? Because the status quo is that male pleasure is almost guaranteed, as opposed to it should be mutual and reciprocal every single time, really and truly.